In 1943, inside a sprawling manor house converted into officers' quarters somewhere in Nazi-occupied Europe, a middle-aged woman named Margarethe moved through marble hallways with the invisibility of a ghost. She carried fresh linens, polished silverware, and scrubbed toilets with the same mechanical precision she'd maintained for 2 years under occupation. The German officers barely glanced at her as she entered their private bathrooms each morning, her hands raw from lye soap, her face a mask of subservient neutrality. But every single day, before placing their toothbrushes back into gleaming porcelain holders, Margarethe performed a ritual that would have earned her immediate execution. She walked down 3 flights of stairs to the mansion's converted basement, pushed open the heavy door marked with a red cross and the word quarantine, and entered the tuberculosis ward where conquered soldiers and local civilians coughed blood into stained handkerchiefs. Then she knelt on that contaminated floor, took each officer's toothbrush, and methodically scrubbed the bristles across the tiles, slick with tubercular sputum. The story you're about to hear isn't about soldiers storming beaches or pilots dogfighting in burning skies. This is about something far more intimate, far more disturbing, and arguably far more effective than any bullet ever fired. This is about biological warfare conducted with nothing more than a cleaning cart and access to the most personal tools of daily hygiene. Margarethe wasn't trained in espionage, didn't receive coded messages from London or Moscow, and never once handled a weapon or explosive device. She was simply a camarera, a housekeeper, a woman whose entire family had been marched out of their village one frozen morning and never returned. The SS had requisitioned her home, converted it into lodging for regional command staff, and kept her on staff because someone needed to maintain the illusion of civilized living while the occupation ground on. They never suspected that the woman who fluffed their pillows and served their morning coffee was slowly, methodically, killing them with their own toothbrushes. The occupied territories of World War II have given us countless tales of partisan fighters, underground networks, and saboteurs who blew up railways and assassinated collaborators. History remembers the dramatic acts, the loud explosions, the public executions of Nazi officials. But there existed another form of resistance, one that operated in complete silence, one that left no evidence except mysterious illnesses that doctors attributed to the stress of war or the changing seasons. Housekeepers, cooks, laundresses, and chambermaids moved through the private spaces of the enemy with keys to every room and access to every intimate object. They saw where officers slept, what they ate, how they bathed, and which personal items they touched to their faces every single morning. The occupiers had created a fatal blind spot by treating domestic workers as furniture, as objects without agency or intelligence, as background noise in their conquest. They never imagined that the woman washing their underwear might possess both the motivation and the method to wage a campaign of quiet extermination. Margarethe's story remained hidden for decades after the war ended, buried in the confession she gave to a local priest in 1957, shortly before cervical cancer, claimed her life at age 54. The priest, Father Thomas, struggled with what to do with her testimony. She expressed no remorse, no guilt, only a cold satisfaction that she'd managed to infect at least 7 officers with active tuberculosis before the manor was abandoned in 1944. 3 of them, she'd heard through village gossip, had died coughing blood in field hospitals far from home. 2 others survived the war but spent years in sanatoriums, their lungs permanently scarred. The priest never reported her confession to authorities, and her account only surfaced when his private journals were discovered after his death in 1982. By then, most of the context had been lost, the names of the officers forgotten, the exact location of the manor disputed by historians who couldn't reconcile the elegant handwriting in Father Thomas's diary with the grotesque method it described. The question that haunts this story isn't whether Margarethe's actions were justified, or whether biological warfare conducted by a civilian crosses ethical lines that even desperate resistance shouldn't breach. The question is simpler and more disturbing. How many other Margareths existed in occupied Europe? How many cooks added ground glass to stews? How many laundresses contaminated uniforms with lice from typhus wards? How many chambermaids performed similar rituals with contaminated materials we'll never know about? The historical record, focuses on organized resistance movements, on networks with code names and radio operators, and supply drops from Allied planes. But the truly invisible war, the one waged by isolated individuals with nothing but access and rage, remains largely undocumented because the perpetrators either died without confessing or took their secrets to graves unmarked by recognition or condemnation. This is the story of how one woman transformed an act of domestic servitude into a weapon of silent revenge, how she turned the occupiers' contempt for her humanity into their fatal vulnerability, and how the most intimate object in a person's daily routine became a vector for their destruction. By the end of this account, you'll understand why Margarethe's confession remains one of the most chilling and controversial documents of resistance from the Second World War, and why her story forces us to reconsider what we think we know about who fought the war and how it was actually won. The manor house that became Margarethe's prison and battlefield had once belonged to her husband's family for 4 generations. Built in 1873 by a wealthy textile merchant, the 3-story structure sat on the edge of a small town in what historians now believe was either occupied Poland or Czechoslovakia, though Father Tomas's journal never specified the exact location. Margarethe had married into this property in 1928, becoming the lady of a house with 12 rooms, a rose garden her mother-in-law had cultivated for 30 years, and a staff of 3 servants who helped manage the estate. Her husband Ernst ran a modest but profitable business importing fabric from Belgium and France, and their 2 daughters attended the regional gymnasium where they studied languages and piano. It was a life of comfortable bourgeois stability, the kind that survives economic downturns and political upheaval through careful neutrality and civic respectability. Then, September 1939 arrived, and neutrality became a luxury no one in Eastern Europe could afford. The occupation of their town happened with bureaucratic efficiency rather than dramatic violence. Wehrmacht units rolled through on a Tuesday morning, established a command post in the town square by noon, and by evening had requisitioned every building larger than 2 stories for military or administrative purposes. A young Oberleutnant appeared at Margarethe's door on the 3rd day with a typed document in German and broken attempts at the local language, informing her that the house now belonged to the Reich and would serve as officers' quarters for regional command staff. She had 72 hours to relocate to approved housing for displaced civilians. Ernst protested naturally, invoking property deeds and international law with the desperation of a man who still believed civilization operated on contracts and mutual respect. They arrested him that same afternoon for insulting a representative of German authority, a charge that carried no trial, no appeal, and in Ernst's case, no return. Margarethe never saw him again, never received confirmation of his death, never got to bury whatever remained of the man who had given her 2 decades of peaceful domesticity. Her daughters, Anna and Sophie, aged 16 and 13, were relocated with her to a cramped apartment above a shuttered pharmacy, 3 blocks from what had been their home. The apartment had 2 rooms, no running hot water, and windows that rattled in their frames every time military trucks passed below. They survived on ration cards that provided barely enough calories to prevent starvation, and Margarethe took whatever work the occupation authorities offered to supplement their allocation. She cleaned offices in the town hall, washed floors in the newly established Gestapo headquarters, and scrubbed pots in the communal kitchen that fed forced laborers from the surrounding farms. Then, in March 1941, the Oberleutnant who'd requisitioned her house appeared at her apartment with another typed document. The officers stationed in the manor required a full-time housekeeper, someone who knew the property's quirks, someone who could maintain standards befitting German officers. The salary was minimal, but came with additional ration cards, and more importantly, wasn't optional. Margarethe reported for duty the following Monday, walking past the rose garden her mother-in-law had planted, now trampled into mud by military boots, and entered through the servants' entrance of what had been her home. For 18 months, she performed her duties with the silent efficiency the Germans expected from conquered people. She learned their schedules, memorized their preferences for coffee strength and pillow firmness, and became as invisible as the wallpaper in rooms where officers discussed operations she didn't understand in a language she barely spoke. Her daughters remained in the apartment. Anna now working in a uniform factory, and Sophie enrolled in a reduced curriculum school where German children of administrators sat in the front rows and local children filled the back. Life had contracted into a narrow tunnel of survival, each day measured by the successful acquisition of bread, the avoidance of arbitrary violence, and the hope that some distant Allied victory might eventually restore what had been stolen. Then in November 1942, the Gestapo came for Anna. The official charge was consorting with enemies of the Reich, based on accusations from a neighbor that Anna had been seen speaking with young men suspected of partisan sympathies. Margarethe never learned if the charge had any truth or if Anna had simply attracted the wrong attention from the wrong German soldier and rejection had led to denunciation. Either way, the result was identical. Anna disappeared into the arrest system, transferred from local detention to a regional facility, and then beyond any point where Margarethe's desperate inquiries could follow. Sophie, terrified and traumatized, was taken to stay with relatives in a rural district, leaving Margarethe alone in the apartment above the pharmacy, alone with her grief, alone with her rage, and alone with keys to every room in the manor house where officers slept peacefully, confident in their security, unaware that the invisible woman who cleaned their toilets had just been given a reason to transform servitude into silent warfare. The tuberculosis ward in the manor's basement had been established in June 1942, when a local doctor convinced German medical officers that housing consumptive patients near the occupied population centers created unnecessary disease vectors that could spread to occupation forces. The solution was practical and cold: convert unused basement storage rooms into a makeshift quarantine facility where tubercular patients could be isolated, monitored, and essentially warehoused until they either recovered or died away from public view. The ward held between 12 and 20 patients at any given time, a rotating population of conquered civilians, captured partisan fighters too sick for interrogation, and occasionally German soldiers from the Eastern Front whose lungs had been compromised by gas attacks or Russian winter conditions. A single nurse, a local woman named Irina who'd trained before the war, managed the ward with minimal supplies and no real hope of cure. Tuberculosis in 1942 was still a death sentence for most patients, especially those weakened by malnutrition, stress, and the various traumas of occupation. The basement reeked of disinfectant, blood, and the sweet, sick smell of advanced pulmonary decay that no amount of ventilation could eliminate. Margarethe first entered the ward 3 days after learning that Anna had been transferred beyond the regional facility, likely to one of the camps whose names circulated in whispered rumors, but whose exact purposes remained deliberately vague. She'd been sent to retrieve medical linens that the upstairs officers wanted repurposed as cleaning rags, the kind of efficiency decision that characterized how the occupation squeezed utility from every captured resource. Irina handed her a bundle of stained sheets and apologized for their condition, explaining that sterilization supplies were rationed, and she did her best with what authorities provided. As Margarethe stood in that basement hallway, hearing the wet coughs echoing from behind closed doors, seeing the red biohazard warnings painted on walls, smelling the concentrated essence of infectious disease, something crystallized in her mind with perfect, terrible clarity. She was holding contaminated material. She had access to the most intimate spaces of the men who destroyed her life. And she possessed the invisibility that came from being considered subhuman, unimportant, beneath suspicion or surveillance. The first time she contaminated a toothbrush happened purely on impulse, without planning or consideration of consequences. She'd been cleaning the bathroom of a Hauptmann who'd been particularly cruel that morning, berating her in rapid German for some minor imperfection in how she'd arranged his desk items. His toothbrush sat in a porcelain holder, bristles still damp from morning use, next to his shaving brush and cologne bottles arranged with military precision. Margarethe picked it up, felt its weight in her hand, and thought about Anna coughing in whatever cell held her. Thought about Ernst disappearing into the machinery of occupation justice. Thought about the rose garden trampled into mud. Then she walked down 3 flights of stairs, pushed open the quarantine door using the cleaning access all staff possessed, knelt on the floor just outside a patient room where someone was coughing blood into a basin, and methodically scrubbed the toothbrush bristles across tiles that Irina had warned her never to touch without gloves. She used small circular motions, ensuring the bristles penetrated every microscopic crevice where tubercle bacilli lived in concentrated colonies, where the bacteria that caused lungs to hemorrhage and filled throats with blood waited for new hosts. Then she walked back upstairs, rinsed the toothbrush under cold water for exactly 5 seconds to remove visible contamination while preserving bacterial load, and placed it back in the Hauptmann's porcelain holder with the bristles pointing up, exactly as she'd found it. Nothing happened immediately, of course. Tuberculosis is not a poison that acts in hours or even days. The bacilli need time to colonize lung tissue, to multiply through bronchial passages, to establish the cascading infection that eventually causes the characteristic symptoms. Margarethe continued her duties with the same mechanical precision, expecting arrest at any moment, half convinced that some German medical magic would immediately detect what she'd done and trace it back to her contaminated hands. But days passed, then weeks, and the Hauptmann simply continued his routine, brushing his teeth each morning with the instrument of his own slow destruction, swallowing bacterial loads with his morning coffee, breathing in the microscopic assassins that now lived in his bathroom. By the time he developed a persistent cough in early January 1943, attributing it to the cold winter and dry indoor air, Margarethe had already contaminated the toothbrushes of 3 other officers using the same method, the same basement floor, the same small circular motions that became her ritual of invisible vengeance. The ease of it terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. No one suspected the camarera who moved through their intimate spaces with keys and cleaning supplies and the perfect camouflage of servitude. No one considered that the greatest vulnerability of any occupation force lies not in their military defenses, but in their absolute dependence on the conquered people who cook their food, wash their clothes, and maintain their personal hygiene. The Germans had created elaborate security systems to prevent partisan attacks, developed networks of informants to detect resistance activity, and implemented collective punishment protocols to discourage sabotage. But they never imagined that the real threat moved through their bedrooms each morning with a mop and bucket, that biological warfare could be conducted with nothing more sophisticated than a toothbrush and access to a contaminated floor, that the invisible woman who cleaned their toilets had transformed herself into a silent epidemic, more dangerous than any bomb or bullet, because she left no evidence, no witnesses, and no way to trace the infects. Tie-ins back to their source until it was far too late for prevention or cure. Margarethe developed a system over the following months that combined careful observation with calculated risk management. She never contaminated more than 1 toothbrush per week, spacing her attacks to prevent any pattern that medical officers might detect if multiple cases of tuberculosis suddenly appeared simultaneously among the manor's residents. She rotated her targets based on opportunity and a cold assessment of who deserved her attention most, prioritizing officers who'd been particularly brutal in their treatment of local civilians or those whose ranks suggested greater responsibility for occupation policies. The Sturmbannführer, who oversaw forced labor deployments, the intelligence officer who coordinated Gestapo roundups, the logistics commander who requisitioned food supplies that left the local population starving while German warehouses overflowed. She memorized their bathroom schedules, learned which officers rose earliest, and which stayed in bed until the last possible moment, understanding that the morning routine provided her safest window when hallways were busy with activity and her presence cleaning would attract no special attention. Each contamination took less than 10 minutes from the moment she entered a bathroom until she returned the toothbrush to its holder, and she never deviated from the precise ritual that had worked the first time. The psychological burden of what she was doing manifested in unexpected ways. At night, alone in her apartment, Margarethe sometimes experienced waves of nausea when she thought about the bacterial colonies she was deliberately cultivating, the infections she was spreading, the slow deaths she was engineering. She'd been raised Catholic, had attended Mass every Sunday before the occupation, and despite her rage she couldn't completely silence the voice that whispered about mortal sin and eternal consequences. But then she would think about Anna's face the last time she'd seen her, terrified and confused, as Gestapo officers dragged her toward a truck, and the nausea would transform into something harder and colder. She justified her actions through a logic that bypassed traditional morality entirely. These men had invaded her country, stolen her home, murdered her husband, and taken her daughter to some place where unspeakable things happened beyond any law or mercy. They'd reduced her to a servant in her own house, made her scrub toilets and wash their undergarments while they slept in beds that had belonged to her family. If they viewed her as subhuman, as a tool to be used and discarded, then she would embrace that invisibility and weaponize it against them with every resource available to her, including the biological agents that grew in the basement ward they'd established in her former wine cellar. The first confirmed casualty of her campaign was the Hauptmann, whose toothbrush she'd contaminated in November. By March 1943, his cough had progressed from occasional irritation to persistent hacking that interrupted staff meetings and kept other officers awake at night. The manor's medical officer, a Stabsarzt who visited twice weekly to handle minor ailments, initially prescribed rest and hot compresses, dismissing the symptoms as bronchitis aggravated by stress and poor air quality. But when the Hauptmann began coughing blood in early April, producing the unmistakable crimson-flecked sputum that marked advanced pulmonary infection, the diagnosis changed immediately to active tuberculosis. Protocol required his immediate transfer to a military sanatorium in Germany, isolation from other personnel, and thorough decontamination of his living quarters. Margarethe watched from a hallway as medical orderlies carried out his belongings in sealed bags marked for incineration, as other officers avoided the contaminated rooms with visible anxiety, as the Stabsarzt lectured assembled staff about the importance of reporting respiratory symptoms early. No one suspected foul play because tuberculosis was endemic in occupied territories, a disease associated with overcrowding, malnutrition, and the generally unsanitary conditions that characterized conquest. That a German officer had contracted it seemed like bad luck rather than enemy action, an occupational hazard of living among diseased populations rather than evidence of deliberate biological warfare conducted by the invisible woman who cleaned his bathroom. The Hauptmann's evacuation created a temporary disruption in Margarethe's access to the manor. Medical teams spent 4 days decontaminating his quarters and the surrounding rooms, restricting staff movement while they fumigated and sterilized every surface. During this period, Margarethe experienced her first real fear that investigation might somehow trace the infection back to her contamination method. She imagined medical detectives examining bathroom fixtures, discovering bacterial colonies on toothbrush holders, interrogating staff about cleaning protocols. But the German obsession with bureaucratic efficiency actually worked in her favor. The decontamination focused on eliminating existing bacteria rather than investigating how infection had originated, assuming that the Hauptmann had contracted tuberculosis through respiratory contact with contaminated civilians during his administrative duties. The report filed by the Stabsarzt noted that occupied territories presented elevated disease risks and recommended that future officer rotations include more frequent medical screenings, but contained no suggestion of sabotage or deliberate infection. Within a week, new officers had been assigned to the decontaminated rooms, bringing their own personal effects and toiletries, creating fresh targets for Margarethe's methodical campaign of invisible vengeance. By summer 1943, 3 more officers had developed suspicious respiratory symptoms that progressed toward tuberculosis diagnosis, though the manor's rotating assignments meant that some were transferred to other posts before their conditions became critical. The Sturmbannführer who oversaw forced labor lasted 7 months before hemorrhaging blood during a staff meeting and being evacuated to a hospital in Vienna, where he died 3 weeks later from complications that physicians attributed to unusually aggressive bacterial infection combined with wartime stress. The intelligence officer who coordinated roundups survived but spent 18 months in a Swiss sanatorium, emerging with permanently damaged lungs that ended his military career and left him dependent on supplemental oxygen for the rest of his life. Word began circulating among occupation forces that the manor carried some curse or environmental contamination. That assignment there was unlucky, that respiratory illness seemed to strike its residents with unusual frequency. Some officers requested transfers, citing health concerns, while others dismissed the pattern as coincidence amplified by wartime anxiety. But Margarethe, moving through their bedrooms with her cleaning cart and her terrible secret, knew exactly what haunted the manor house that had once been her home, and she had no intention of stopping until the war ended or they discovered her, whichever came first. The isolation that accompanied Margarethe's secret campaign created a psychological prison more confining than any physical cell. She couldn't share what she was doing with anyone, couldn't seek advice or absolution, couldn't even hint at the truth during the rare moments when other domestic workers gathered in the manor's kitchen to share whispered complaints about their German employers. The other housekeepers and cooks who worked alongside her had their own stories of loss and humiliation, their own reasons to hate the occupation, but Margarethe understood instinctively that revealing her method would transform her from invisible servant into hunted criminal. Even among the conquered, there were informants who traded information for extra rations or protection for family members, collaborators who decided that survival required alignment with the occupiers rather than resistance against them. So she maintained her mask of weary compliance, participating in the small acts of petty sabotage that other workers engaged in, the deliberately over-salted soup or the accidentally scorched shirts, while keeping her far more lethal activities locked behind a facade of dutiful servitude that revealed nothing about the biological warfare she conducted 3 floors below their gossip sessions. The relationship between Margarethe and Irina, the nurse who managed the tuberculosis ward, evolved into something strange and unspoken during this period. Irina never directly acknowledged what Margarethe was doing, never asked why the camarera made increasingly frequent trips to the basement with excuses about retrieving supplies or checking storage areas. But the nurse began leaving certain doors unlocked that regulations required secured, began timing her rounds so that the hallway outside the most contaminated patient rooms remained unobserved for predictable 15-minute windows, began providing Margarethe with subtle warnings about which areas of the basement floor carried the highest bacterial loads based on recent patient hemorrhages. Whether Irina had deduced the truth through observation or simply recognized a kindred spirit engaged in her own form of resistance remained ambiguous, preserved through a silence that protected both women from the consequences of explicit conspiracy. They existed in a space of plausible deniability, where Margarethe could claim ignorance about contamination risks and Irina could claim ignorance about unauthorized basement access, while both understood perfectly well that they were collaborating in a campaign that violated every medical ethic and military regulation governing occupied territories. The psychological toll of sustained isolation and secret violence began manifesting in Margarethe's physical health by late 1943. She developed chronic insomnia, lying awake in her apartment, calculating the mathematical progression of her infections, wondering if the officers she'd contaminated months earlier were dying in distant hospitals or recovering to continue their participation in atrocities she could only imagine. Her appetite diminished to the point where her already rationed food allowance went partially uneaten, her body consuming itself as her mind consumed her conscience with questions about whether she'd become the very thing she was fighting against. Was there a meaningful moral difference between the SS officer who pulled the trigger on a mass execution and the camarera who delivered death through contaminated toothbrushes? Both killed deliberately. Both targeted victims who couldn't defend themselves. Both operated outside any framework of justice or proportional response. The only distinction was visibility. The officers' murders were documented, photographed, memorialized in the historical record, while hers would remain forever invisible, attributed to natural disease rather than human agency, erased from history even if they succeeded in their lethal purpose. Yet despite these psychological erosions, Margarethe never seriously considered stopping. The arrival of each new officer at the manor presented a fresh opportunity for assessment and potential targeting, a grim routine that gave structure to days that would otherwise collapse into meaningless repetition of cleaning and servitude. She developed an almost professional detachment when evaluating which Germans deserved her attention, weighing their cruelty against their probable future impact on the occupation's machinery. A young lieutenant who treated her politely and seemed uncomfortable with the brutality around him might be spared, allowed to brush his teeth in safety, while his more enthusiastic colleagues received her special attention. But a Gestapo interrogator, who arrived in April 1944 with blood still visible under his fingernails and a reputation that preceded him through whispered warnings among the staff, he received contamination treatment within 48 hours of moving into the manor's second-floor guest suite. Margarethe had become a judge, jury, and executioner, operating entirely in shadow, dispensing sentences that would take months to fulfill, but which she delivered with the same mechanical precision she applied to folding hospital corners on German beds. The closest Margarethe came to exposure happened in August 1944, when a newly assigned medical officer, younger and more thorough than his predecessor, decided to investigate the manor's unusual tuberculosis incidence rate. He spent 3 days reviewing medical records, interviewing staff, and examining the physical premises for environmental factors that might explain why officers stationed in this particular building seemed to develop respiratory infections at rates significantly higher than comparable postings. He questioned Margarethe directly, asking about her cleaning protocols, the chemicals she used, the ventilation systems in various rooms. She answered with the nervous deference expected from conquered civilians being interrogated by German authority, her hands trembling genuinely from fear, while her mind remained cold and calculating behind her submissive expression. The medical officer ultimately concluded that the manor's age and poor ventilation, combined with proximity to the basement tuberculosis ward, created a contamination risk that required architectural modifications and enhanced air filtration systems. His report recommended either relocating the ward or evacuating the officers to more modern facilities, but by the time these bureaucratic recommendations circulated through appropriate channels, the Red Army was advancing from the east, and German administrative priorities had shifted entirely toward evacuation and retreat, rather than building improvements in soon-to-be-abandoned territories. The summer of 1944 brought changes to the occupation's character that even the most isolated civilians could detect. The confident swagger of German officers transformed into nervous efficiency as news from both eastern and western fronts filtered through official channels and underground networks alike. Convoys that once moved leisurely through town squares now rushed past with urgency, carrying supplies eastward toward collapsing defensive lines rather than westward toward secure territories. Officers who'd spent years treating the manor as a comfortable posting began burning documents in the garden, packing personal belongings preemptively, and holding increasingly tense meetings behind closed doors where Margarethe could hear raised voices arguing in German, too rapid and technical for her limited vocabulary to follow. The tuberculosis ward in the basement began emptying as medical resources were redirected toward frontline casualties, with chronic patients either transferred to facilities deeper in German-controlled territory or simply released to die in whatever accommodations their families could provide. Irina received transfer orders to a field hospital unit, departing with a final wordless glance at Margarethe that conveyed everything their silence had protected, and the basement fell into administrative abandonment, its contaminated floors left unsterilized, as occupation priorities shifted entirely toward tactical survival rather than public health management. Margarethe's campaign of invisible vengeance entered its final and most reckless phase during these months of approaching liberation. With the manor's population in constant flux as officers rotated through on abbreviated assignments before being deployed elsewhere, and with administrative oversight collapsing under the weight of military crisis, she abandoned her careful spacing of contaminations and began targeting every new arrival whose rank or behavior suggested active participation in occupation atrocities. A Hauptsturmführer who arrived with a convoy of newly arrested resistance fighters received contamination treatment his first night in residence. An administrative officer coordinating final resource extractions before retreat found his toothbrush treated within hours of unpacking. Margarethe no longer worried about pattern detection or medical investigation because the German bureaucracy that might have noticed such patterns was disintegrating around her, its attention focused entirely on retreat logistics rather than epidemiological mysteries. She made the trips to the abandoned basement ward with increasing frequency, no longer needing Irina's careful coordination, simply walking through unlocked doors into rooms where contaminated materials still festered on floors no one bothered cleaning anymore, where the concentrated bacterial colonies she needed lived undisturbed in their ideal growing conditions of darkness, moisture, and organic decay. The psychological calculation that had troubled her earlier completely dissolved during this period, replaced by a cold arithmetic that measured her remaining time in terms of how many more officers she could infect before liberation arrived, or the Germans executed her for some unrelated offense. She stopped sleeping entirely for days at a stretch, functioning on adrenaline and the manic energy of someone who understands they're living on borrowed time and wants to maximize every remaining moment. Her physical appearance deteriorated to the point where other staff members asked if she was ill. Noticing the hollows under her eyes and the way her cleaning uniform hung loose on a frame that had shed weight she couldn't afford to lose. But she continued her routine with obsessive precision, cleaning rooms, folding linens, and contaminating toothbrushes with the same methodical attention she'd maintained since that first impulsive act in November 1942, now transformed into a systematic campaign that had infected at least a dozen officers, and possibly more whose diagnoses would come months or years after they'd left the manor and attributed their infections to other sources entirely. The moment that should have been Margarethe's greatest triumph arrived in September 1944, when news reached the manor that the Sturmbannführer who'd overseen forced labor operations had died in a Vienna hospital from tuberculosis complications, his lungs so destroyed by infection that he'd essentially drowned in his own blood over the course of several agonizing days. Word of his death spread through the remaining staff, with the kind of grim satisfaction that conquered people take in their oppressors' suffering, though no one except Margarethe knew that his death had begun months earlier in a manor bathroom, delivered by contaminated bristles that had scraped across a basement floor. She felt nothing when she heard the news. No satisfaction or vindication or sense of justice served, just a hollow acknowledgement that one more calculation in her arithmetic of vengeance had resolved successfully. The emotional capacity for triumph had been burned out of her through months of sustained psychological isolation, and the corrosive effect of keeping secrets that poisoned the keeper as surely as her contaminated toothbrushes poisoned their targets. She'd become a machine calibrated for one purpose, operating with mechanical efficiency until either liberation arrived or the machine broke down completely under stresses no human psyche was designed to bear indefinitely. By October 1944, the manor's German occupants had been reduced to a skeleton staff, managing final evacuations and coordinating the retreat of military units still operating in the region. Most officers had already departed for assignments elsewhere, leaving behind empty rooms that Margarethe cleaned more from habit than necessity, her targets now limited to a handful of administrators and logistics personnel who'd drawn the unfortunate assignment of managing occupation's final collapse. She contaminated their toothbrushes with the same precision she'd applied to more senior officers, treating a supply clerk and a communications officer and a junior Gestapo functionary with equal attention, no longer discriminating based on rank or responsibility, because at this terminal stage of occupation, every German in the manor represented the system that had destroyed her family, and every one of them deserved whatever microscopic vengeance. She could deliver through their daily hygiene routines. The basement ward stood completely empty now, its patients evacuated or dead, but the floors remained gloriously contaminated, a bacterial reservoir that required no maintenance and no oversight, just Margarethe's twice-weekly visits to refresh the colonies on toothbrush bristles that would carry death into German mouths for as long as the occupation lasted. The manor was finally abandoned on November 3, 1944, when Soviet artillery began ranging shots that fell close enough to shatter windows in the upper floors and send plaster dust raining from century-old ceilings. The remaining German personnel evacuated in a chaotic convoy of overloaded trucks and staff cars, leaving behind furniture too heavy to transport quickly and documents burning in oil drums scattered across the lawn where Margarethe's mother-in-law's rose garden had once bloomed. No one gave her formal dismissal or final instructions. The officers simply disappeared between dawn and noon, and by early afternoon, the manor stood empty except for Margarethe herself, standing in the marble entrance hall where she'd once greeted guests as the lady of the house and more recently scrubbed floors as a conquered servant. The silence felt overwhelming after years of boots on stairs and German voices echoing through rooms. A quiet so profound that she could hear her own breathing and the distant rumble of artillery that marked liberation's approach. She walked through empty bedrooms one final time, seeing the spaces where officers had slept peacefully while tuberculosis colonies established themselves in lung tissue, seeing the bathrooms where toothbrushes had sat in porcelain holders awaiting their morning contamination, seeing the physical evidence of her invisible war scattered across a building that would soon change hands again as armies rolled over it toward other battles in other territories. The liberation itself proved anticlimactic compared to the dramatic expectations Margarethe had constructed during 4 years of occupation. Soviet advance units arrived on November 7th, securing the town with efficient brutality that suggested they'd performed this operation countless times, across countless similar towns, stretching back to Stalingrad and beyond. The soldiers were young, exhausted, and largely indifferent to the complicated political realities of occupied territories, seeing only enemies to eliminate and strategic positions to secure as they pushed westward toward Berlin. Margarethe emerged from the basement, where she'd sheltered during the final artillery exchanges, expecting some moment of recognition or acknowledgement for her survival. But the Red Army had no special interest in individual civilians beyond ensuring they wouldn't interfere with military operations. She received the same cursory registration as other town residents, her name added to lists of displaced persons and survivors, her story of occupation documented only through bureaucratic checkboxes that captured nothing about what she'd actually endured or what she'd done in response. The Soviet political officers who arrived days later to establish occupation administration had no interest in German toothbrushes or basement tuberculosis wards, concerned only with identifying collaborators, securing food supplies, and establishing the infrastructure of new authority that would replace old authority without fundamentally changing the experience of being conquered. Margarethe returned to the apartment above the shuttered pharmacy and waited for Anna to come home, maintaining the magical thinking that liberation would somehow reverse arrests and restore stolen family members the way it restored stolen territory to Soviet control. She waited through November and December as refugee convoys passed through town, as surviving resistance fighters emerged from forests and hiding places, as families slowly reassembled from scattered displacement and forced labor camps across occupied Europe. But Anna never returned, and eventually Margarethe stopped asking about her, stopped filing inquiries with Soviet administrators who had no records and no interest in tracking individual fates among millions of displaced persons and victims. The best information she ever received came from a survivor of Ravensbrück, who'd been processed through the same regional facility where Anna had been sent in November 1942. A woman who vaguely remembered a young girl matching Anna's description, but couldn't say with certainty what had happened to her, or whether she'd survived the initial selection process that determined who worked and who died immediately upon arrival at the camp themselves. Sophie returned in February 1945 from the rural relatives who'd sheltered her, now a withdrawn and traumatized 17-year-old who barely spoke and flinched at unexpected sounds. Mother and daughter rebuilt some approximation of life in the pharmacy apartment, surviving on Soviet rations and what work Margarethe could find cleaning buildings that had changed ownership but still required the same domestic labor regardless of who occupied them. She never returned to the manor house, couldn't bring herself to walk through those rooms again even after Soviet officers converted it into administrative headquarters and needed cleaning staff. The building carried too many ghosts, too many memories of what she'd done in bathrooms and basements, too much evidence of the person she'd become under occupation's pressure. Instead, she took positions cleaning Soviet offices and officers' quarters in other buildings, performing the same domestic servitude for new conquerors while trying to reconcile the woman who scrubbed floors with the woman who'd waged biological warfare against an occupying army, using nothing more than contaminated toothbrushes and access to intimate spaces. The years immediately following liberation blurred into a struggle for basic survival that left little energy for processing trauma or seeking recognition for resistance activities that had operated entirely in shadow. Margarethe never spoke about what she'd done during the occupation, never sought acknowledgement from resistance organizations that formed after the war to document and celebrate partisan activities. Her campaign didn't fit the heroic narratives of armed fighters or saboteurs who'd struck visible blows against the occupation, and she had no proof of her effectiveness beyond memories of toothbrushes and basement floors and the satisfaction of knowing that at least some of the officers who'd stolen her home had died coughing blood in distant hospitals. The tuberculosis infections she'd deliberately spread couldn't be distinguished from naturally occurring disease. Her victims couldn't be counted with certainty, and her method was too disturbing for the clean narratives of resistance that emphasized courage and sacrifice, rather than intimate biological warfare conducted through the violation of personal hygiene. So she remained silent, carrying her secret through the post-war reconstruction, through the establishment of new governments and new occupations, through the slow process of trying to rebuild a life from the ruins of everything the war had destroyed. The decades that followed liberation brought Margarethe no peace, only the slow accumulation of losses and the gradual physical deterioration that accompanies survivors who've pushed their bodies and minds beyond sustainable limits. Sophie married a factory worker in 1948 and moved to a different district, maintaining dutiful but distant contact with her mother, the trauma of their separation during the war having created a gulf that neither woman possessed the emotional vocabulary to bridge. Margarethe continued working various cleaning positions through the 1950s, her labor becoming increasingly difficult as chronic pain settled into joints worn down by years of scrubbing floors and carrying heavy buckets up and down stairs. The post-war government that controlled her region changed twice during this period, borders redrawn by powers negotiating spheres of influence in conference rooms far from the towns where ordinary people tried to survive the consequences of those decisions. She watched new ideologies replace old ones, new uniforms replace familiar ones, new bureaucracies emerge to manage populations that had learned through bitter experience to keep their heads down and comply with whatever authority currently held power. The manor house where she'd waged her invisible war changed hands multiple times, serving as Soviet administrative offices, then briefly as a school, then falling into disrepair as maintenance budgets disappeared and the building's value couldn't justify the cost of preserving a relic from an era everyone wanted to forget. The cancer diagnosis came in January 1957, delivered by a physician who explained that cervical cancer at her age and stage meant she had perhaps 6 months to a year remaining. Margarethe received the news with the same stoic acceptance she'd cultivated during occupation, asking practical questions about pain management and whether she could continue working until physical limitations prevented it. But the diagnosis triggered something in her psychology that years of silence hadn't resolved. A desperate need to confess what she'd done before death erased her testimony and left her actions completely undocumented in the historical record. She'd maintained her silence for 12 years since liberation, never speaking about the toothbrushes or the basement ward or the systematic campaign of biological warfare she'd conducted against German officers. But facing mortality with no children who'd survived to carry forward her story, no husband to remember her, beyond the official narrative of occupation victim, she felt the weight of erasure pressing down with unbearable force. If she died without confession, her resistance would be lost completely, attributed to natural disease or random misfortune rather than deliberate human agency exercising the only power available to the utterly powerless. Father Thomas had served the parish church since 1952, a younger priest who'd survived the war in a seminary far from combat zones and carried none of the traumatic baggage that marked his generation. Margarethe had attended his masses occasionally, maintaining the minimal religious observance expected from culturally Catholic women of her background, but had never sought confession or spiritual counsel for the simple reason that she didn't feel guilty about what she'd done and saw no point in pretending otherwise for ecclesiastical purposes. But in March 1957, as cancer pain began requiring medication that left her thoughts fuzzy and disconnected, she appeared at the church rectory asking for private confession, explaining that she had testimony requiring documentation before her death. Father Thomas, assuming she wanted standard end-of-life absolution for conventional sins, led her to the confessional booth and prepared for the usual litany of minor moral failures that elderly parishioners brought to final accountings. What he heard instead was a calm, methodical description of biological warfare, conducted over 18 months against German occupation forces, delivered in precise detail about basement floors and bacterial colonies and toothbrush contamination methods, narrated with the clinical detachment of someone describing routine household tasks rather than systematic killing. The priest's initial reaction combined disbelief with profound moral confusion about how to respond to a confession that violated every framework he'd learned in seminary training. Canon law provided clear guidance for conventional sins, confessed with genuine contrition, but offered no precedent for handling testimony about biological warfare, conducted by an elderly cleaning woman who expressed no remorse whatsoever and seemed interested only in ensuring her actions were documented rather than forgiven. Father Thomas asked the obvious questions. How many officers had she infected? How many had died? Did she feel guilt about the suffering she'd caused? Did she seek absolution or merely acknowledgement? Margarethe answered with mathematical precision about the 7 confirmed contaminations she could verify through subsequent diagnosis, the 3 deaths she'd learned about through various channels, the unknown number of additional infections that might have occurred but couldn't be traced definitively to her actions. She expressed no guilt because she felt none, viewing her campaign as justified self-defense conducted by a civilian population against an occupying military force that had forfeited any moral consideration through their own atrocities. She wanted documentation, she told Father Thomas, because someone needed to know that resistance had taken forms beyond the celebrated armed partisans, that the invisible war waged by domestic workers and other conquered civilians had been just as real and possibly more effective than the dramatic sabotage operations that dominated post-war resistance narratives. Father Thomas struggled with what canonical and moral obligations applied to testimony that was simultaneously confession, historical documentation, and implicit challenge to his authority to judge actions taken under circumstances he'd never experienced. He couldn't grant absolution to someone who refused to express contrition, couldn't dismiss actions that violated fundamental prohibitions against deliberate killing, but also couldn't simply ignore testimony that revealed a hidden dimension of resistance history. His compromise was to document Margarethe's confession in his private journal, recording her testimony with careful detail, but without editorial comment or moral judgment, treating it as historical evidence rather than spiritual confession. He visited her 3 more times before her death in July 1957, each conversation adding details about her methodology, her psychological state during the campaign, her current lack of regret about actions she viewed as proportional response to occupation atrocities. At no point did he report her testimony to civil authorities or suggest she deserved punishment for wartime actions that had occurred under radically different legal and moral circumstances. He simply preserved her story in careful handwriting, creating the only documentary evidence that Margarethe's invisible war had ever happened, evidence that would remain hidden in a private journal for another 25 years after both confessor and confessed had died. Margarethe died on July 22, 1957, in the same pharmacy apartment where she'd waited uselessly for Anna to return, attended in her final hours only by Sophie and a district nurse who administered morphine for pain that had become unmanageable through any other means. Her death certificate listed cervical cancer as the cause. Her obituary in the local parish bulletin ran 3 sentences identifying her as a widow and mother who'd survived the occupation, and her funeral drew perhaps 20 people, mostly elderly parishioners who attended every funeral out of social obligation rather than personal connection. She was buried in the town cemetery, in a plot far from the family monument, where Ernst's name appeared without a body beneath it, her headstone bearing only her name, and dates with no epitaph to suggest that her life had contained anything beyond the ordinary suffering that marked her generation. Sophie cleared out the apartment within a week, discovering nothing among her mother's minimal possessions that hinted at wartime activities beyond standard occupation survival. There were no hidden journals, no preserved evidence, No photographs or documents that suggested Margarethe had been anything other than what she appeared, a cleaning woman who'd endured conquest and lost her family and died quietly of cancer without leaving ripples on history's surface. Father Thomas continued his pastoral duties for another 25 years after Margarethe's death, maintaining his private journal as a habit, but never sharing its contents with anyone who might have contextualized or verified the extraordinary testimony it contained. He wrestled periodically with whether he had any obligation to make Margarethe's confession public, whether resistance history deserved her story, even if her methods disturbed conventional moral frameworks, but ultimately defaulted to the confidentiality of the confessional booth and the canonical prohibition against revealing what had been shared in sacred trust. His journal remained locked in his personal desk, pages accumulating testimony from other parishioners alongside Margarethe's account, the whole archive treated as spiritually privileged material rather than historical documentation. When Father Thomas died in December 1982 from complications following a stroke, the parish administrator who cleared his rectory discovered the journals while cataloguing personal effects for distribution to surviving relatives. The administrator, a younger priest with historical interests, recognized immediately that the journals contained potential value beyond their spiritual function, particularly the detailed accounts of wartime experiences that might contribute to understanding occupation's daily realities. The decision to preserve Father Thomas's journals in the parish archive rather than destroying them as potentially compromising confessional material sparked debate among church officials who worried about precedent and canonical propriety. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The journals would be archived with restricted access, available only to credentialed historians conducting legitimate research, with identifying details redacted to protect the anonymity of individuals who'd shared testimony under assumption of confidentiality. Margarethe's confession survived this redaction process because she died 25 years earlier, and Father Thomas had recorded sufficient detail about dates and circumstances that her identity could be reconstructed through cross-referencing with occupation records. The first historian to examine the journals in 1984, a doctoral candidate researching civilian resistance in occupied territories, initially dismissed Margarethe's account as either fabrication or exaggeration, the biological warfare method seeming too deliberate and too effective to be credible testimony from an uneducated cleaning woman. But further research into the manor's wartime medical records, preserved in fragmentary form in various archives, revealed an unusual cluster of tuberculosis diagnoses among officers stationed there between 1942 and 1944, a pattern that supported rather than contradicted Margarethe's claims. Verification of Margarethe's testimony proved impossible through conventional historical methods, because the very nature of her campaign had been designed to leave no traceable evidence. The officers she'd infected had attributed their illnesses to natural causes. The German medical establishment had investigated environmental factors rather than sabotage, and the post-war chaos had scattered or destroyed most detailed medical records that might have documented individual cases. The historian could confirm that tuberculosis had appeared with unusual frequency at the manor, could verify that several officers had been evacuated to sanatoria or had died from pulmonary infections, but couldn't definitively prove that Margarethe's contamination method had caused these specific cases rather than the general disease environment of occupied territories. The academic paper that eventually emerged from this research treated Margarethe's confession as probably credible but fundamentally unverifiable, an example of how invisible resistance operated below the threshold of documentary evidence and historical certainty, leaving behind only testimony and circumstantial correlation rather than the clear evidentiary chains that historians prefer. The broader historical community received this research with profound ambivalence when it was finally published in a specialized journal in 1987. Some scholars viewed Margarethe's story as revelatory, evidence that resistance had taken forms far beyond the documented armed partisan activities, proof that domestic workers and other invisible populations had waged their own campaigns using whatever weapons their positions afforded. Others criticized the methodology of treating unverifiable confession as historical evidence, arguing that wartime testimonies were notoriously unreliable and that Margarethe might have exaggerated or fabricated her entire account to create meaning from suffering that had otherwise been utterly powerless and meaningless. The ethical debates proved even more contentious than the evidentiary questions, with historians arguing about whether Margarethe's actions constituted legitimate resistance or war crimes, whether biological warfare conducted by civilians against military occupiers deserved celebration or condemnation, whether the intimate violation of contaminating toothbrushes crossed moral lines that even desperate resistance shouldn't breach. These debates never reached resolution because the fundamental question remained unanswerable. Without definitive proof, historians could neither condemn nor celebrate actions they couldn't verify, leaving Margarethe suspended in historical uncertainty, neither hero nor villain, but something more disturbing and ambiguous that resisted easy categorization. The legacy of Margarethe's confession extends far beyond the academic debates about verification and ethics, raising fundamental questions about how we understand resistance, power, and the invisible wars waged by people we've trained ourselves not to see. History celebrates the dramatic acts, the armed partisans who ambushed convoys and the saboteurs who destroyed railway lines, because those actions fit narratives of heroism that can be commemorated with monuments and medals. But Margarethe's story belongs to a different category entirely, the resistance of people who had no access to weapons or explosives or organized networks, who possessed only their labor and their intimate access to enemy spaces and their willingness to transform the most mundane objects into vectors of death. How many other domestic workers across occupied Europe conducted similar campaigns that left no evidence except mysterious illnesses attributed to natural causes? How many cooks added ground glass to officers' meals? How many laundresses contaminated uniforms with disease-bearing materials? How many chambermaids performed rituals of invisible vengeance that killed slowly and left no fingerprints? The historical record provides no answers because this form of resistance operated specifically through invisibility, through the exploited gap between what conquerors noticed and what they dismissed as beneath their attention. The ethical complexity of Margarethe's actions resists the clean moral frameworks we prefer to apply to wartime behavior. She deliberately infected human beings with a fatal disease, targeting them not through combat, but through the violation of their most intimate daily rituals, killing them slowly and painfully in ways that might have infected innocent medical personnel or other civilians who came into contact with contaminated materials. By any conventional definition, she engaged in biological warfare, a category of weapon that international law has sought to prohibit precisely because of its indiscriminate nature and capacity for uncontrolled spread. Yet she operated as a civilian under military occupation, stripped of legal protections and any legitimate means of self-defense, watching her family destroyed by an enemy that viewed her as subhuman while depending on her labor to maintain their comfort. If we condemn her methods as crossing ethical lines, what alternative did occupation leave her? If we celebrate her resistance, what precedent does that establish for justifying biological warfare conducted by desperate populations against military forces? These questions have no satisfying answers because they expose the inadequacy of conventional moral frameworks when applied to the extreme circumstances of total war and genocidal occupation. The story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about whose resistance we acknowledge and whose we erase from historical memory. Margarethe's campaign was arguably more effective than many celebrated partisan operations, potentially killing or permanently disabling a dozen enemy officers with zero risk of civilian casualties from reprisals or failed operations. Yet her methods were too intimate, too disturbing, too disconnected from honorable combat narratives for easy commemoration. We're comfortable celebrating resistance when it looks like soldiers fighting soldiers, when it operates through recognized military frameworks, even if conducted by irregular forces. But resistance that operates through domestic labor, that weaponizes cleaning supplies and personal hygiene items, that exploits the enemy's contemptuous assumption that servants are invisible and harmless. This form of resistance troubles the boundaries between civilian and combatant, between legitimate warfare and criminal violence, between heroism and something darker that we lack adequate vocabulary to describe or judgment to evaluate. The manor house where Margarethe conducted her invisible war was finally demolished in 1993, its structure too deteriorated for renovation and its historical significance too ambiguous for preservation funding. The land was cleared and converted to a small commercial development, a pharmacy and dental office, now occupying the footprint where officers once slept, and Margarethe once contaminated their toothbrushes in basement darkness. No historical marker commemorates what happened there. No monument acknowledges the biological warfare conducted through domestic servitude. No official recognition validates Margarethe's resistance or condemns her methods. The tuberculosis ward where she sourced her bacterial weapons is buried under concrete and asphalt. The basement rooms filled and paved over, the contaminated floors that served as her arsenal erased completely from physical landscape. Only Father Tomas's journal preserves testimony about events that occurred there, locked in a parish archive, where perhaps 3 or 4 historians per decade request access to examine accounts that most readers still dismiss as unlikely or exaggerated or morally too disturbing for serious consideration. What remains most haunting about Margarethe's story isn't the specific acts she committed or the officers she may have killed, but the question of how many similar stories died with their protagonists, never confessed or documented or preserved in any form that would allow later generations to know they'd happened at all. The invisible populations who moved through enemy spaces, who cooked their food and cleaned their quarters and laundered their clothes, who possessed both motive and opportunity for resistance that operated below the threshold of historical documentation. They're absent from the archive not because they didn't resist, but because their resistance was designed specifically to be invisible, to mimic natural disease or accident or simple misfortune, rather than reveal itself as deliberate human agency. Margarethe only entered history because cancer gave her urgency to confess, and Father Tomas had the instinct to document rather than merely absolve. Without that conjunction of terminal illness and careful record-keeping, her campaign would have remained completely lost. Attributed to tuberculosis's natural prevalence in occupied territories, another invisible woman erased from a history written by people who only noticed the loud and the documented and the conventionally heroic. Her story survives as a disturbing reminder that the wars we think we know were always accompanied by shadow wars we'll never fully document, conducted by people we trained ourselves not to see, using weapons we never thought to fear.